What's up, traders? Matt from the Trade Brigade here with your weekend crypto report, where as always, I do a technical analysis and give you my thoughts on the coins listed up above. A couple of changes to the watch list. Certainly, we still have Binance Coin, Solana. We definitely have Polkadot. This week, we're not going to spend too much time on DOGE or SHIB. However, Sandbox as well as Crypto.com coin have really been getting a lot of attention. And I think there's actually some decent setups there in the face of a relatively nasty pullback. So with all of that being said, let's start off on our Bitcoin daily chart here. A couple of things, right? In last week's video, we talked about the bear case on the backtest of 59,800, call it 60K even if you like nice round numbers, right? And that essentially panned out. So I want to reiterate that one more time. Basically, all markets are groups of people who are buyers and groups of people over here who are sellers. All of the buyers who were up here who got it wrong and confirmed they got it wrong on the failed backtest of 60K essentially turned into sellers. Now, not all of them, sure, some of them still are holding, but a majority of them, right, they are now overhead supply. They could have potentially sold, and that put the pressure on the Bitcoin market to go lower. Now, I certainly want to acknowledge that the headlines out there about the new sickness variant, as well as inflation fears, as well as I've seen some headlines about crypto being in a bear market, all of that stuff certainly adds up and makes it easier for people to sell. But at the end of the day, don't let anyone fool you into saying that a market isn't just made up of two sides of the same trade. So in my estimation, that's the real reason why crypto sold off. What are we going to do about it though? That's where things get interesting, and that's the purpose of today's video. So starting off with Bitcoin, as we know, we've talked about this over the past couple of weeks, really. These are building blocks, and they're building blocks in the forward and upward direction, right? One of them is subsequently stacked higher than the past. So to me, and I'll be completely transparent about this, I actually bought some Bitcoin at $54,010 to try to get ahead of that 54K even number right around in here. Now, can you see how that would be a logical entry point for a long position? I'll also be transparent. My strategy is not, to scalp it into the backtest here or the resistance trend line. No, it's a buy and hold type investment for me, at least in crypto. You can do what you will with this information, but I want to at least build the case of why I think it's a reasonable entry point anywhere sort of around this area. Not only do we have the building blocks in the upward direction, right, doing something like this, we're testing the bottom end right now, but we also have this big shelf of support from in the past. So if we're going to use this as the range for the newest building block which is forming, then it makes logical sense to me, at least, to be a buyer at and around this area. The other thing you could look at would be this sort of support trend line and the overall trend of Bitcoin. Now, it's not perfect here. However, you can certainly start to see that we're getting closer to this support point in Bitcoin. Now, I would prefer if we stayed above that 53,000 mark. However, this is just a buy zone in my estimation for Bitcoin. So do with that what you will. Wanted to be transparent about what I'm doing. The other thing you could say is, let's say you don't have a buy and hold strategy. You're only looking for maybe a rotation back to 60K. That's fine. Where do you put your stop? Well, obviously the trade is invalidated if we break down underneath 53,000. So from a risk reward perspective, from that aspect of trade plan, it also makes sense to me that this is like a screaming buy inside of Bitcoin. Now, I could be completely wrong. It could go lower, but the risk reward makes sense. It also makes sense from the longer term investment perspective that we're back testing the prior building block high. With all of that jibber jabber out of the way, sort of maybe that's just me justifying my own position. Let's drill down to the 4-hour, talk a little bit more nuance and what I think could potentially unfold over the course of the weekend. So obviously you can see from a more micro perspective, here's a trading range. We've fallen out of that trading range. As I mentioned, I really do believe that there's a lot of support around $53,000 per coin inside of Bitcoin. So in my estimation, we're likely not going to see some sort of crazy move like that to the downside. Could it happen? Sure, but I just don't see it as being the most probable. Instead, what I potentially see here is a back test of let's call it $56,000 per coin, and then you reevaluate the chart, right? Does it look like we're going to roll over and there's another down leg, or does it look like we poke our heads back up into this prior range? And if that's the case, what do we have on our hands, right? If this is the prior range, this would be a look below, fail back into the range. Technically speaking, the target should be the top end, which is once again that infamous level of about $60,000 per coin. Don't get me wrong, we have the resistance trend line in there as well, but that would be the upside target here in Bitcoin. That's really what I'm watching out for, just to sort of keep tabs on the position. Is it working? Is it not? If we get a significant move to the downside, let's say this downtrend here really gets kind of nasty, what would be the next support below inside of the prior building block? I would encourage you to keep an eye on this level right here. I'm just going to roughly map it out at around $47,000 per coin. And the reason I'm picking this is because we have a lot of congestion here, perfect support for a double bottom, some congestion and, resistance slash support. You get the gist, right? As this high volume area in here, that to me would make sense as the first magnet if price is going to fall back down into range. It would also provide a higher low from the perspective that we're not moving all the way back down to the prior low of that previous building block, right? It would be about a 50% retracement if my eyeballs are correct here. Looks to be about 50%, right? And technically speaking, if this is your major low, this would be a next potential higher low and still keep the daily uptrend alive inside of Bitcoin. So hopefully that deep dive in Bitcoin was useful. This is sort of the driver for the rest of the crypto market, correct? So I think it's worth spending a little bit of time analyzing. Let's keep going now, get into Ethereum, get through some of these coins a little bit quicker. In Ethereum, sort of the same principle applies. This is your overhead supply, sort of failed at the resistance trend line, rolled back over, back at the bottom end of the range. In this one, it's simply all about holding up above about $4,000 per coin. You could argue that it's $3,950, this general area of support, right? So in here, it's can we break above 41.65 and keep chopping around in this area, eventually breaking that resistance trend line. That, in my estimation, sets up the bull case in Ethereum. If retested, this 39.50, that's where I would be careful, noting that this could potentially all turn into overhead supply on a break here, and that would lead to a fairly nasty move in my estimation inside of Ethereum from a pattern perspective. Although it's not the cleanest left-hand shoulder, you could treat this as kind of a shoulder, this is a head, and this is shoulder number 2 with a neckline right at this area. So a very, very sloppy head and shoulders pattern. However, you can certainly build the case for this neckline being a very critical must-hold area of support. Once again, that's at 39.50 on a breakdown. The first target underneath is this prior technical level at 36.58, and then anything underneath, let's just go ahead and map it out so we're prepared. I would start focusing in on 33.79, 33.80-ish area. As the chart sits, again, I can't really say for sure whether or not this is a bullish or bearish chart. I mean, to me, this is starting to turn into a bear flag, but we're also back testing this prior breakdown point from in here. So all things considered, it's really what side of this level right here do we spend more time on over the course of the weekend and early next week? If it's below, start to look for this to turn into a larger 4-hour bear flag, right? That case would look for the breakdown of 39.50, or if we break back above, start spending some time here, look for the resistance trend line to potentially break over the course of either the weekend or early on next week. So Ethereum, not quite as clean cut of a setup as Bitcoin in my estimation. Binance Coin is up next. This one is also still respecting higher lows, right? If we talk about low, higher low, higher low, technically we still have a bit of an uptrend in play. We also have high, higher high, higher high. So I would say that this one is actually looking good in terms of trend continuation. It's just a matter of can we continue to put in a new higher high? And that might be asking a little bit much of Binance Coin at this point, noting that we would have to make a new all-time high, I believe. No, it can't be an all-time high since we have this 691 overhead, but you get the gist, right? It would basically be back up towards recent highs and new all-time highs to continue this uptrend. What I think is a more likely scenario is something like this. Maybe the uptrend continues, but it's not clearly a higher high yet. So again, the entry point in Binance Coin, not as clear to me as what we just saw in Bitcoin. Ethereum, again, it's sort of more along the lines of that, where I can't really say for certain, noting that we're kind of back testing this breakdown point from in here. So I would echo the same sentiment, right? If we can poke back above, start spending more time above this, let's call it a range between 605 to 615. If we can spend more time above, obviously more bullish, I would start to look for this to turn into an ascending triangle, correct? That would be a bullish pattern, looking for the breakout ultimately up and over that 668 to get to all-time highs, and then blue sky territories up and over that. If we start breaking down and spending more time underneath this sort of pivot point, like if this is just a fake break to the upside, that's where it gets more bearish, and it's still not as bearish as Ethereum. I would say Ethereum's more bearish in that instance, but to me, starts to threaten the support trend line and this horizontal level we have here. A breakdown of that should take us into about 520. You can walk the levels down from there. The next major zone is 455 to 437. Binance Coin, again, kind of a sit, be patient, just like we saw in Ethereum, but slightly stronger than Ethereum. Let's go on over to Cardano now, clearly exhibiting a lot of relative weakness, which again, I think is so interesting, remembering that back in here, it was the relative strength monster. So all of that move is kind of unwinding. You can certainly notice that our resistance trend line is steep and it's actually holding. So to me, this one does not look too good for a long here. I would really need to see some sort of pattern to emerge down here to start to be more confident in that. So whether or not it turns into an inverted head and shoulders like this, break of this kind of neckline takes us higher, maybe it's that, but for now, it's not really worth speculating on unless we can break the resistance trend line. That would be the only instance where you could say, okay, if we do something like this, start consolidating into like a 4-hour bull flag just below this level, the break obviously takes us to here about 190. Okay, so maybe that's a potential setup, but it's just not clear. Again, that's very, very speculative speaking. The same thing with that inverted head and shoulders. So to me, I would stay away from this one unless we get that clear pattern set up, noting that the downtrend is fairly strong. We've also unwound a majority of this move. The only thing it sort of has going for it around this 150 area is that it's the prior top end of this building block right here. You can see how much time was spent underneath, and when the breakout actually occurred, really meaningful breakout, right? So maybe this area is a significant support, but I don't see the long setup as of right now. If you're a buy and hold investor, then maybe it makes sense to pick up some down here. For me, it's not really something I have in my portfolio. I would rather stick to the Bitcoin and Ethereum. So, do what you will with this analysis, noting where we are, but I just don't see this downtrend just ending in the blink of an eye. It would really take some sort of pattern in my estimation. Solana is our next victim, and this one is still in a symmetrical triangle, if you will, noting that we've come into our major dominant, right, support trend line from here. Here's a perfect touch. We've bounced off of it nearly perfectly, forming a new neckline. So this is sort of like your Ethereum. Here's shoulder 1, head, shoulder 2 here. This big neckline is your must-hold area inside of Solana at 184.16. If it breaks, it would also be a break of the support trend line, taking us into the next level at 168, we'll call it for round number sake, remembering that that's just like in Bitcoin, a very critical building block, right? You could look at this one like this. Obviously, this was trying to be a new building block, sort of failed back down. Notice we didn't come all the way into those lows from in here. So, it's not the most bearish thing, but if it breaks, you can clearly see how that would be the target, correct? 167.92, reevaluate the chart from there. As the chart sits now, it's all about this level, which we're kind of back testing, right? The 202.35, call it 202, the round number. If we can get back above that, I think it's a straight shot into the resistance trend line, then reevaluate. Are we going to get the breakout? Is it going to be a bullish sort of move higher into the next levels? We have them mapped out, but still in the symmetrical triangle. If you're going to be sort of trying to play this one, I would be very patient and just either wait for a break of the resistance trend line or a breakdown of this to take us into some next supports, which we identified underneath, noting that head and shoulders pattern could be unfolding underneath that critical support at 184. Let's just go ahead and pick out one more support underneath in case there's that larger downdraft here. And I would sort of have to advise you about this one around 145, we'll call it for round number's sake. You can see support, prior congestion as well in here, resistance kind of area, support kind of area in here as well. So to me, a bigger downturn in crypto takes us probably to that area over the course of time. I'm not saying overnight, anything like that. And as of right now, this double bottom is certainly holding up. So patience inside of Solana is probably what I would advise here. Litecoin is up next. This one's fairly bearish, noting that this range right here did break down just like Bitcoin, kind of inside of, let's go ahead and grab the other tool, sort of inside of this chop zone. And we spent so much time in this that I'm just not convinced that it's easily going to produce something back up and out of it. I think the likely scenario in Litecoin is probably chop in this range until we either get to the resistance trend line, then roll to the downside, or if we can do something like this, chop and then break into it sideways, I think this is your next choppy range. So to me, it doesn't really make sense that it's a huge reversal point here. It's also not something that I would really add into the long-term portfolio, remembering its relative weakness to Bitcoin overall. We talked for weeks and weeks on end about this range right here, whereas Bitcoin was back up towards its highs. It's just not there in Litecoin. So for that reason, I would expect more chop in some of these lower ranges, not as bullish in my estimation. Ripple is up next, and this one's certainly falling out of a range as well. You could look at this here as a larger head and shoulders. We talked about this the other week, right? Here's sort of a base that we had formed, certainly below that now. So to me, breaking down underneath this, breaking back down into sort of this range right here, not really too attractive. Hopefully you can get the sense of where my confidence sort of lies, aka up here. And in Ripple, it's a patience play, right? It's either going to be chop in this range, which I don't want to be a part of, or the breakout is back up and over about $1, right? If you want to technically look at the bottom end of this, the top end of this prior range right here, it's up and over 1.0104 to potentially take us into the 1.0723. Again, just not really seeing it as something I want to be overly involved in at the moment. It's not like it's slamming into a prior top end of the range. It's actually inside of that range, correct? So Ripple, not really there for me. Sort of a patience play, 50% of the range, 50-50 shot on whether or not it tests here or rolls over to the bottom end. Your edge, as we know, literally exists at the edge for either breakout or mean reversion, and the same down here, mean reversion or a breakdown to the next level. Not seeing it here in Ripple. Polkadot is up next. This one's certainly looking like that head and shoulders pattern. Here you go, breaking down underneath the neckline in this one, and sort of just like we talked about in Ripple, we're in the middle of this range right here. We're back in a congestion point from here. So again, not as much confidence as what we saw in Bitcoin in my estimation. However, if it can chop around in here, the only breakout I would sort of take would be up and over 37 to get into that 42 top end of the range. In here, we would also be clearing the resistance trend line. And this is something that I would prefer to trade, noting the price point, right? This is like a mid-range crypto. It's not your Bitcoin, $50,000 per coin, and it's also not sub $1, right? So this to me is definitely something reasonable for trading. There's also plenty of volume, right? 2.2 million, I was going to say shares, but coins traded in the session, in the daily session, excuse me there. So definitely something that is liquid enough and certainly at a reasonable price point for it to be worth it for a trade, correct? So that's what I would watch out for here. Not really worth speculating long in here, noting that we've sort of fallen back down into this prior, let's redraw that, kind of this, into this prior building block, right? If the theme of this video is building blocks, notice how we've already broken down underneath, whereas as I'll go back to it one more time, Bitcoin is still sitting up on the edge, and it could break down, but as of right now, it has shown us that it's not quite ready to do that. So not seeing too much here in Polkadot. Next up, we have the Doge. Really not spending too much time here, noting that we're at a very, very important area of support right around 19 cents. And again, if you think about this as an overall range, kind of smack in the middle, 50-50 shot for higher or lower to our next support or resistance. Not really seeing the reason to be overly aggressive to the long side. As we know, Bitcoin's sort of the joke coin at this point in time. It really requires some momentum to start taking off, and I'm just not seeing it. It's not there from a social sentiment, nothing. I really don't think it's worth getting involved at these levels. Same sort of deal with Shiba. I mean, it had its moments. I mean, fantastic setups, fantastic flags that were in play, and this one just sort of trickled lower, right? There's really no reason to be involved now that it's broken down underneath this level. I could potentially see this, let's go ahead and get rid of that. There we go. I could potentially see this acting as a double bottom, but your neckline is still way up here. So there's no real action to take unless we take out this 44.44, right? So from here, if we can break this, fine, start walking it up into, I would say, this level right here. So let's throw that on the chart just so we have it. That's going to be around 50.70, right? And it would also coincide with a break of the minor trend line, something like this, noting that the major trend line from the highs, it would have been it's too steep, right? You can't really rely on that trend line right there. So the minor trend line is really the one to focus on. Still, the neckline, if it's a double bottom, is way overhead at that 44.44. Not seeing much here until this level is actually recaptured for the trade here, maybe there. And again, just like Doge, would really require some social sentiment behind it. And I really think that's shifted to some other coins, which is a great segue into Sandbox, right? And if you look at this chart, I mean, my goodness, night and day difference from what we've seen across the rest of the cryptos that we've been discussing today. Look at how perfect this has flagged here, flag here, big flag here, and now yet again, another large flag. So I can't guarantee that it's going to continue to flag, but right, in trading, we do what works until it literally doesn't. And in the case it doesn't, we have a tight stop, right? So I would want to see it remain sort of in this range here. And if we can break over this resistance trend line, fairly steep. I don't know if that holds forever. In my estimation, right, it's probably going to go sideways through that and consolidate, especially if the rest of crypto is kind of weak. So maybe you watch out for a breakout up and over like 780, $8, somewhere in there. Basically looking for this to turn into a larger bull flag, and on a break, I would argue that $10 is certainly on the table for Sandbox. So keep that in mind. And just remember the relative strength here. It's really hot in terms of social sentiment. A lot of people are talking about it. So in my estimation, as long as that continues, definitely looking for more upside here inside of Sandbox. Could it break down? Yes. And in that instance, you're just not taking a trade, right? Or if you're already involved, maybe you book some profits. I would really love to see it hold on to the prior top end at 566 if there's going to be a larger downdraft to here. That, in my estimation, let's take out the fibs just to check. I don't know if it'll be exact, but if we do something like this, I'm looking for the 61.8. Yes, would you look at that? So a thing of beauty, right? As we know, the 61.8 is always your line in the sand. If you start closing candles underneath, very likely you 100% retrace the move. So to me, that's the next must-hold level at that 566. So Sandbox definitely on watch for a potential bull flag continuation play here, as long as it wants to remain hot on social media. Next up is Crypto.com coin, and this is going to act in terms of fundamentals, right? Sort of identical to Binance Coin. It's going to be, you know, their own platform's coin. And with the whole Crypto.com naming rights for the Staples Stadium, I mean, it just checks out as a momentum style play, a lot of hype and social behind it. So to me, this pullback, it's all about, can we hold up at this prior breakout point? So let's throw that on the charts here. Around 0.5873. We'll leave it off at that. If this is going to continue, that's your must-hold area, and from there, start to watch for it to work its way higher. If it takes it out to the downside, I really wouldn't want to be interested in, you know, holding this thing kind of in this range. Sure, is there definitely some smaller trades to have there? Absolutely, but from a longer term, you know, as I sort of mentioned, my strategy would just be buy and hold. That's the sort of area I want to see it hold. If it wants to put in some sort of double bottom here and just, you know, hold at this area, oops, if we do something like this, that's your double bottom, then fine. Technically, the neckline's way up here, so that's not really in play. But, you know, if it wants to hold here and it starts exhibiting signs of strength again on good volume, then yeah, just walk up some of your targets. I would say your next major area to pay attention to would be here around 0.8118. And then we'll, of course, walk up another one. I would argue it's here, 0.89. And then, you know, you never want to cherry pick the true all-time high. You want to have signposts, right? If we get to here, reevaluate. Does it look like the sellers are going to take over, or are the buyers still strong? Same thing here. And then obviously as we get into blue sky territories, that's more of that breakout area. Certainly keeping an eye on one, the nice round number as well. With all of the social sentiment behind it, with the Staples Center thing behind it, I really think it can continue just like we talked about with Sandbox. So in my estimation, those are the two to really be watching for. In terms of short-term trades, it's no longer about the Doge. It's no longer about the SHIB. It's about the Sandbox and the Crow, if you will, for shortening's sake. So that's going to wrap up the video. If you enjoyed it today or learned anything new, let me know in the comments section or by giving the video a thumbs up. I know it was a long one, in depth today, but really that's how you have to look at every single market. Don't forget the weekly watches will come out on Sunday as scheduled, and all of that being said, I wish you a green trading week.